Hello everyone, my name is Michael Steen, I'm the CEO of Atlas Air. And we're here together with our partners from Aston Formula One team and the Miami Dolphins. We are here together partnering for a discussion regarding a very important cause. And that is a discussion around men's mental health and wellness in general. And we are going to have a great conversation here with representatives from all of our organizations. And I hope that can be a great inspiration for all of you to participate in the conversation as we move forward.
So in the airline industry in general, I think challenges are really barriers. There are many. For some people outside of aviation, a barrier might be something like cost of access to mental health care or just having that availability. For aviation professionals, those barriers are actually fear, stigma, and ultimately the possibility of losing their careers.
Yeah, very similar in Formula One. I think where performance is key, and it's really important that everybody performs at their best all the time. Mental health is critical in terms of making the correct decisions, being able to respond in critical situations, but also it's costly. In an environment where, we are really focused on cost pressures under the cost cap. Mental illness, within Martin Aramco is the number one reason why employees are absent, especially within our male individuals. So it's really about reducing costs, being more efficient, reducing turnover, and ultimately being a more efficient and effective business.
I think it's our job as leaders in our industry to help educate our employees and help to demystify what's really important about seeking mental health and understanding that by going out and getting help doesn't mean that you're unable to perform in your position or that it makes you a lesser person. Truly, I think that using all the resources that are available to us, again, as leaders, really is important.
I suppose there's two sides to that, isn't there? I mean, the first side is making sure that we reinforce the message that it's okay to not be okay and that it's acceptable to ask for help. And then the second part that I pick up from what you just said is really about how do we build in mental health initiatives, how do we build in mental health KPIs into our performance systems. And I think that's a really important element for us, is how do we make sure that we prioritize leaders and we train leaders as how to identify mental health issues within our employees, but then encourage them as part of our KPIs to really instill initiatives and develop initiatives around supporting people. And it's all about the metrics nowadays, right? Yeah. So we've got wonderful tools that we're able to use to be able to track trends in absenteeism, in sickness data, and if we can just get our managers and our leaders in businesses to focus on those metrics and those KPIs, I think that will go a long way in terms of really supporting our people.
There's been a positive shift over the course of time. All but a decade ago, it was taboo to bring up mental health because of the stigma and the norms around it. So we're seeing a lot of development in that area. I think the disconnect really is around the framing of how it's being discussed, how it's being delivered to people, and individuals are having a hard time identifying how does this relate to me. And then there's fear of, if I do bring this up, how are they going to feel about me? We talk about perception gap at Movember as part of our research, and perception gap really just boils down to the fear of what other people are going to think about me, no matter what I do. So we've found that the idea of what other people believe about us outweighs our own values, and that shapes our behaviors. And so that's where the gap is also increasing between, there's resources, but am I really going to get the help that I need? What does that mean for me? And is there a lack of education around mental health as well on top of that? So what are companies doing to fill that gap in is important.
In our world, the focus is always on what makes the car go faster. That is, everything we do is driven around making the car go faster. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to also remind, our people what opportunities or what, support there is available, and really just focusing on it to prevent the stigma or to, get away from the stigma that you referred to.
Especially in the aviation industry, when you think of airline pilots, you think of kind of the calm, cool, and collective aviator, somebody who's always in control. And in that narrative, you typically don't talk about asking for help, right? That's just the stereotype that is out there. But What I think really is important is getting the narrative out there that being calm, cool, and collective also includes knowing when asking for help is appropriate and destigmatizing it.
Absolutely. And to piggyback off of what you're saying, I think we need to begin to talk about how the inside game is a whole game, right? Mental health does not translate to just crisis. Mental health is a way of being, and it's relatable to anything. Us sitting here right now has to do with mental health, right? We're talking about it, but how does it impact us as we're having this conversation, right? What's firing off in our brain as we're having this conversation, right? What does it mean to us? And the meaning behind anything and everything we do is what drives or reinforces our actions. So it's great that these conversations are happening, but are we actually educating ourselves as we walk into these conversations or these companies where they have these resources? Are we asking the people, is this what you need? Are we comfortable enough to talk about it as well? When someone comes to us, are we educated enough to know how to respond to that? A big example that I use is it's easy for us as human beings to talk about having a peanut allergy, but we find it difficult to say that we have anxiety or depression, right? So that's where the stigma comes from.
And I think one of the ways I found is quite effective is to frame mental health as part of a holistic wellness package. You know, I think we are never afraid to go to a doctor if we've got a sore leg or we've got a cold, you know. So that's your physical wellness. And then looking at your mental wellness as part of that holistic structure, you know, together with your spiritual wellness, whatever that means for you. And then having that sense of purpose. And I think if you focus on those 4 elements of well-being, you know, it becomes more acceptable to talk about the well-being. It's not a stigma attached to mental health, but it's about what are the 4 pillars that you need to be holistically well as an individual and to be able to perform at your best.
No, you said something that really struck me because there's a lot of similarities I see between F1 and the aviation lifestyle, and especially the part about the traveling, right? Our aviators, our pilots, our flight attendants, they're out on the road, you know, hundreds of days out of the year, missing important family events, missing holidays, and all of that has an impact on somebody's mental health. So I think as leadership, understanding the impact that actually has on our employees, and then being able to provide outlets, as you were talking about with your program, I think is very important.
So one thing I've always wondered is, and it doesn't matter whether you're a professional rugby player or a football player, is the amount of stress that must be on you to be able to continually perform at your peak and to be at the top of your game. I mean, how does that weigh on your mind?
It's very interesting because I truly believe that high performers, especially people that are successful in elite sports, we have an unhealthy ability to compartmentalize. Like we just push it to the side, put a lid on it for right now, and go out there and do your sport, whether it's, you know, blocking, tackling, catching footballs, or if it's driving. You know, it's one of those things that it's probably very unhealthy, but you know, it's one of the skill sets, one of our superpowers.
I suppose you do that because that's the way you perform. But at, you know, at some point in time, I suppose you have to deal with those emotions. Otherwise, yes, they could manifest into mental health issues and even physical illness.
Exactly. So it basically comes where you only take care of it when it becomes a crisis, and that's one of the things that we're trying to change that script, trying to change that around sports and make it where you're not balancing, but it's more of a part of your performance. So not only how fast you run, how much you can and lift, it's also how do you deal with those emotions on a daily basis. So it becomes the full conversation, it becomes a full package of who you are.
And how open to, you know, sports people to that conversation?
Well,
because we know there's a lot of stigma around
there's a lot of
mental health.
stigmatism around mental health. There's a lot of, you know, especially when I played, you know, talking 30 years ago, I came into the NFL. The conversations were different, but now it's more open. I love it, like in the locker room when the veterans are openly talking about it. So, you know, you get the younger guys talking about more and more. And there's a stat out there that, you know, there's like 40%, like in 2021, 40% of the guys got help mentally or had just a conversation around that. And now, as of 2024, that number was up to 82%. So just goes to show, just in that short period of time, that we're accepting of it and bringing that conversation into the locker room, into the building. It makes it a lot easier for guys to just go seek help when they need it.
No, there's definitely a shift, a really positive shift as well. And I think also if you can always include the science, I know in our world, if you can always include some form of data and some form of science, it is that much easier to accept, you know. And I always like to think of the stress quadrants, you know, where you've got on the one side, you've got positive stress and positive energy, and that's where we perform at our best. And then the antithesis of this is where you've got, you know, low positivity or negativity and low energy, and that's really that burnout zone.
Yes.
So it's how do we keep people in the performing zone for longer? How do we keep, whether it be our teams, you know, our race teams, or, you know, the 1,000 people we've got back at our technology campus in Silverstone, how do we keep everybody in that performance zone?
So what the NFL has done is that they have a full-time mental health clinician at the facility. I would like to say that 2026 is mandatory, but the Dolphins have done it way before that. So they've done it several years before that. And it's definitely becoming, you know, just like you go to your athletic trainer when you need to get your knee or ankle looked at, you have that person in the building, and just that visibility of that person being around on a daily basis, being in there at the meetings, being in there when you're eating at the training table, or when you're outside at practice. Just the visibility makes that conversation a little bit better and easier, and it just becomes part of your routine. And that's all athletes are. I mean, they're just used to doing something daily, every day. When you disrupt that routine, that's when you have problems.
Yeah, we've actually done something quite similar now. We've got a psychologist that actually travels with the team to most of the races, and that has been really, really powerful. Not only do they go to the races, but they spend time with us back in the factory to really understand people's mindset going into the race. But what it does is it's someone that's with you that you become, you know, familiar with and you trust. Because I think that, you know, the concepts of psychological safety, I don't know if it's the same in your world, but that comes up a lot for us. And every time we look at a new initiative or we look at a new program, we need to understand and really appreciate, does that add to the psychological safety of the team?
Yeah, and you have to have the players buy into it, you know,
exactly.
and that buy-in doesn't come without that trust. So again, with that person being around on a 24-hour basis of every day in and day out, just like your nutritionist, you're taking care of what you put in your body. You also have to make sure that mental health is part of that equation as well.
You know, many of us got into aviation at younger ages in the sense that we've always dreamt about being an airline pilot. And part of that means being an airline pilot is essentially being confident, not, you know, being able to operate under pressure. And to be able to address mental health concerns doesn't really fit that narrative. So the stress that you're talking about, well, certainly coming to all these races, I imagine it wears on your body and makes you tired and fatigued. Certainly in aviation, especially international, we fly across many time zones. We're missing family events and really on the road more than we're at home. All of these factors come together and can really impact our mental health and our willingness. I think the culture and the stigma has been a culture of unwillingness to go out and seek help.
You know, when I was racing, I had in Formula One the biggest crash I've ever had back in 2000 in Monza.
Okay.
It was a huge crash. I rolled the car in the air. I fell, you know, on my head. I was really, at one point, I see it now in slow motion, but I saw death quite close. And if it was not because I raced in that era, where the cars were a lot more safe rather than a few years before, I wouldn't be here. But after that, it gave me the extra confidence that if I've gone through this accident, I think nothing can happen to me. I mean, not because I am, you know, or whatever. It's just because Formula One is very safe.
Sure.
And this gave me a very strong confidence that even if I made a mistake, I was safe.
So do you feel like that constant pressure of though having to perform, not crash, not, you know, to place on the podium, is that constant pressure?
Yes.
Does that have an impact on your mental health?
Definitely. I mean, the biggest pressure which affects mental health that the Formula One driver has is the fact that you always have to be faster than your teammate.
Right.
You know, your teammate is pushing you every day with the same machinery, with the same equipment, and if in Formula One you are not faster than your teammate, it probably means that it's your last season.
Okay.
and you will be fired, you will be replaced. So that gives you such a big, gives you pressure, gives you anxiety, and it obviously affects mental health. And that is the biggest problem the Formula One drivers face, more than safety.
So do you feel like actual performance outweighs the pressure from safety in terms of what gets inside of their head and impacts them?
Yes.
That's very interesting.
This is definitely, and especially because all the Formula One drivers know that it's a very safe sport.
Right.
Of course, there's the element of risk, but like in aviation, if you go through all the procedures, you know that it's very safe.
So as a driver, what do you think, what sort of resource has been available, or even when you drove and then nowadays?
Nowadays, the drivers, definitely they're trying to optimize their schedule so that they arrive as late as possible to the track, which also has an impact on time zones. Sure. And so it's not that simple. And then as soon as the race is over, they leave, so that they can optimize. They are at the racetrack the minimum time possible, because you have to do 24 races. Also, when I was racing, you did less race weekends, 16, but then every week you were testing. And nowadays testing is basically forbidden. So drivers have more downtime to spend with family, which is better.
People don't understand this. They see you play on Sundays. They don't realize how much time you spend in that building during the week,
Yes.
preparing during the off season. Right now being on that field, so it's one of those things where it just becomes just like we lift weights. We make sure that what we eat. Now we have that person that's there with us, and it makes a conversation a lot easier.
And you think that so players are not stigmatized as much as before, or if you need, for example, some mental health somehow?
Yeah, but we're creatures of habit. So if we're constantly being around it, it just becomes part of the routine.
Okay.
It becomes part of that weekly, daily routine that we're doing, and it just becomes part of that whole, trying to be that better player, trying to build that better player. So, like I was saying, is we're getting in the weight room, we're doing what we have to do, we're making sure we're putting in our, fueling our bodies what we're supposed to. That person being able to talk to and being able to be there in the building makes it a lot easier to have that conversation. So it completes that whole picture of what a complete player is.
Okay, it is funny because actually I think that in Formula One it is exactly the same, in the sense that in my time, if you had any mental issue, any problem, or insecurity, or you were losing confidence on what you were doing inside the car, or you had fear, you just had not to mention it to anyone. You had to solve your problem alone. Yes. Most of the time. And if the results were not there, you could always, in my sport, you can always blame the tires, the engine, the aerodynamics, there's many things to hide under, So, but nowadays, it's very common and very, very modern, and the new generation drivers really accept the fact that they need a sports psychologist to extract all the performance. So it seemed like something strong, a strong fact or a strong point in a driver if he looks for help, because he is trying to extract more performance from himself, So it has really changed, and this is really, I think it's really good.
No, I do. I do. It's good to see, and it's good to see that change. Because we were in it those many years ago, and we see that progression, and it's really refreshing. Because I have kids, I have young boys, and I understand growing up and trying to be, a high performer, just not in sports or anything else, but at a profession, a job, and it makes it very, it's very refreshing to see that they can get that.
Refreshing is the word, yes. And also the thing in Formula One is that now the new generation drivers, if they kind of blame themselves more and more, and this is great because it has to be like that. We are not perfect. In my time, you always said drivers never make mistakes. It's always
well, we always had to be perfect. I mean, in football, you have to win every play. And people don't understand is you break a play down. It's before, during, and after. And you have to score 100% on 60-something different times in one game. It's very difficult, and especially when you're going against another human being. So it makes it very difficult. It's when you try to internalize it and you're not able to get it out. And then the other things that are going on in life as well, eventually it boils over. and it's going to result in burnout or a crisis or something like that. That's when it really, you want to get ahead of that. So
Yeah, so as I sit here and listen to you talk, I pick up on a few things where I see a lot of similarities. One of the things I do realize, I think, is that the aviation industry is probably a little bit further behind than, say, the NFL and F1. But the good news is we're getting there, right? So with the legislation that's coming out and really this effort of educating the aviation professionals about mental health, I think we're getting to a spot to where we need to be. But again, as pilots, we're taught that we need to be perfect. We need to be high, performing individuals, just like drivers and just like, players. And that stigma of a high performing individual doesn't ask for help, that stigma is going away. And I think that is probably one of the single most important pieces of knowledge for people to understand. And really to get that message out is what really matters.